Read with me the preparation for the Word of God stated together. Let us read together. All Scripture is inspired by God and is profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training. Lord, may I hear and receive your word today. As we open our Bibles on this Lord's Day to the 27th chapter, the book of Acts, I do this with mixed emotions this morning because there's only one more chapter remaining. It's chapter 28. We have taken a long journey. It's been quite a journey. We started several months ago looking at the book of Acts in chapter 1. We have followed the beginnings of the church, the ascension of Jesus, the empowering of his disciples, as Christendom began in Jerusalem and now has spread over the entire world at that time. It has been a powerful journey, and many lessons have been taught, many lessons have been learned. We're now in our division number 5, as we have been studying for several lessons now, this prisoner, Paul, faithful prisoner, Paul, the great apostle. We have followed his journey. Today's lesson is going to be the first 44 verses of chapter 27. The title of today's lesson is The Perfect Storm. The Perfect Storm. There was a movie out not too long ago entitled The Perfect Storm. I don't know if anyone saw that movie, but it gave good, vivid illustration and demonstration of the power of the sea. The power of the sea as man tries to navigate his way through it. In this lesson, we're going to find Paul shipwrecked after surviving a horrible storm at sea. And we will also learn that if we put our trust in God's sovereign care for us as we go through life's storms, that he will use us to bear witness to many. Some Christians say that those who are rightly related to God will never suffer in the storms of life. Well, the Apostle Paul never got that message. He was in God's perfect will, and he found himself in a great storm. And instead of removing Paul from the storm, we will learn and read today that God saved him through the storm. There are 4 major divisions in this chapter, and we will look and study this passage of Scripture following those divisions. We will talk about, first of all, the ship, and we will look at the companions. We will look at those who were a part of this ship, this movement. And then we will spend a moment and talk about the storm, the fierceness of the winds, and the effect of the storm upon its passengers. And then as we move down to verse 21, we will slide into the sermon, the word of conviction and courage and confidence and the challenge that God used Paul to get across to all the inhabitants of this ship. Then as we close out this chapter, we will look at the shipwreck. We will find them finding land and fearing and fleeing and dealing with discouragement and going forward and finally finding safety. Now this is pretty much a narrative. It's going to give you a story. You can read it in less than 10 minutes. And it's good. It's a good story as we've been following Paul as he makes his journey to Rome. Our last lesson in the 28th chapter, we will find him finally making it to Rome. But this is a narrative, and so we're going to acquaint you with the events of this story. But what's most important to me is how we apply it. What's the lessons? And so hopefully as we move through this, we can fill in our outlines and get the story under our belt, and we can move quickly to the applications. The summary that you see in your outlines, and plus there are a couple more lessons that I would like to just give you in regarding this powerful chapter that I felt like it would have been too much if I had put it all in the bulletin. So we want to move and talk about the ship, the storm, the sermon, the shipwreck, and then we will look at our summary in regarding this powerful, powerful demonstration of God. I love history. I love American history. I love African American history. I love world history. I love biblical history. I'm just a history buff. I read history books. I teach history in school. I love history. And one of the things about history that has fascinated me has been the number of ships that have had shipwrecks, that have been totaled, that have gone down. And I look at some of the shows on Discovery Channel and seeing them dive and try to find these ships and try to find some of the valuable goods that were once a part of these ships. Who cannot forget 1912, the Titanic, 1915, the Lusitania, the Estonia in 1924. These two ships were a part of the beginning of World War I. These were great ships that were lost at sea, and so many others. Included in that so many others is this shipwreck that we find in our text today, in this New Testament. We don't know the name of the ship. We don't know the exact date that it left its port in the city of Myra in Asia Minor, or the date that it went down in the Mediterranean Sea, just off the coast of the island of Malta. But we do know that the Apostle Paul, by the grace of God, was on board of that ship and that he was saved. As we continue this amazing, dramatic journey in the final chapters in the life of the Apostle Paul, Acts chapter 27 is divided into these major parts: the ship, the storm, the sermon. We find that the Apostle Paul is doing what he has always done in the face of great danger and obstacles. We find him trusting God, turning to God. We find him looking for an open door, an opportunity to tell someone about the gospel. I love that about Paul, because every situation that we have found him in, whether he was free or whether he was in prison, there was always a looking for an opportunity to tell someone about the gospel. And so this situation is not going to be any different. Let's look, as we look at these first 12 verses, let's look at, first of all, the ship. The ship. Paul has been handed over. Remember, previously he has gone through several trials. Anybody remember who he stood before in the first trial? Festus. Okay. Anybody remember who he went before in the second trial? Felix was number one. Felix was number one. Festus was number two. And then King Agrippa was number three. It's been approximately about 4 years, give or take. He spent 2 years between Felix and Festus. So it's been about 3 or 4 years that Paul has been in Caesarea. They've been trying to get him to Rome because that's what he has asked to do, since they accused him in Jerusalem of desecrating the temple and trying to try him for treason in Rome. So he has now been handed over to a Roman centurion by the name of Julius, who has the responsibility of transferring this great apostle to Rome from Caesarea. The first thing that we learn is we learn of his companions. We learn of those who are traveling with Paul. Read with me portions of verse 1 and portions of verse 2. when it was decided that we would sail for Italy. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy. I want you to notice, first of all, the we. The we that you see in verse 1. We haven't seen this we since we left chapter 12. Who's the we referring to? None other than Luke, the author of the book of Acts and the author of the Gospel of Luke. Remember, Luke had accompanied Paul on his journey. Luke is now with him again as he makes his journey to Rome. And it's going to be Luke who's going to give us an eyewitness account of the perils of this journey. There's also another companion with him in the second part of verse 2. Would you read verse 2, Elder Van? Can you read verse 2?
And embarking in an Andromedian ship, which was about to sail to the regions of the coast of Asia, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica.
Okay, stop there. We put out to sea. Now the we, once again, is Luke. And we're talking about Luke and Paul. They put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus. Notice who he is. He is a Macedonia from Thessalonica. So, who are Paul's companions? Luke. And this man, Aristarchus, this Macedonia of Thessalonica. They are mentioned again. This last man is mentioned in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, and also in the Philemon, verse 24. Colossians 4 and 10, and Philemon, verse 24. So it's Luke and this man Aristarchus. They are Paul's friends, and they are Paul's companions, and so they are with him, giving Paul support. Now, some theologians say they had to place themselves in the position of a slave to even ride with Paul. Some theologians say they were friends traveling with Paul to keep him company. Whatever spin anyone wants to put on him, the scripture says that they are with him. They are with him for support and giving him courage. Now we look at Paul's commander. Go back to verse number 1. Read verse 1, Deborah.
When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius.
All right, now stop right there. So Paul is a prisoner, and we got some other prisoners, and they have all been delivered to this centurion. Now, this word centurion means what? We've read this several times in the book of Acts. That he is a man over at least 100 soldiers. Okay, the word centurion means 100. So this is a Roman official. And so there is at least 100 other men, soldiers, on the ship of this Augustan named Julius. Read on down to verse 3, Deborah.
And embarking in an Andromedian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary.
Okay, stop. Now we learned something about this centurion. We learned that he is a Roman commander. We learned that he is apparently a just man. He's a kind man. He is a man who has given Paul and his companions an opportunity to visit friends in Sidon, where the ship has stopped. Paul obviously was trusted by this commander. And this commander also held Paul in high esteem. Unfortunately, the positive beginning of the relationship between Paul and this commander will be tested. So, as we look at our outlines,
I'm in that first panel.
Okay, all right. We have number one, the first thing is the ship. That should be chapter 27, verses 1 through 12. Under the ship, you should have Paul's companion, which is going to be chapter 27, verse 1a and verse 2b. And then you should have Paul's commander, which is going to be chapter 27, 1 through 3. And then we're going to have Paul's course, the course of the ship. So D would be the course. No, C is the course. C is the course, 27 verses 4 through 8. Read verses 4 through 8, Deborah.
From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had rise at Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salome, and with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea.
Now, in a perfect situation, in an ideal situation, with good winds, this sailing ship would have left the coast of Israel, and it probably would have sailed straight across the western part of the Mediterranean Sea to reach Italy. But with these westerly winds that were against them, is going to take them a whole lot longer. So they're going to have to stop at several ports along the way. The condition of the sea is not going to allow them to sail straight through. We find them switching a ship, switching to an Egyptian ship that's headed straight for Italy. Probably this is a grain ship, a ship full of grain that was leased by the Roman government for the sole purpose of moving food and supplies across the Mediterranean Sea to support the Roman soldiers. We're told by Ken Hughes, as he's writing about this particular verse, the ship was probably 140 feet long and 30 feet wide with a 33-foot drop. It was a sturdy ship, but in the high seas it would have some disadvantages. There was no rudder like the modern ships that we have, and it was steered by two great paddles extending from the stern or from the front part of the ship. It had only one mast on which a great square sail was rigged. And chief among its drawbacks was that it could not sail into the wind. So their best hope was not to encounter any kinds of storm on this journey. This was a clumsy, big kind of ship that did not sail well in winds and storms, and is going to face this type of weather as they head toward the island of Crete. And they want to finally make their first port at Fairhaven on the southern coast of the island of Crete. This was 2 steps forward and 1 step back. They would make a little journey forward and a 1 step back, as they are going to come in conflict with the sea. Now, Paul is going to give them some counsel. Paul is going to give them some counsel in verse 9 and 12. I want you to listen to the counsel that Paul gives them, verse 9 through 12. Elder Van.
When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only to the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what Paul was saying. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there. If somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend winter there.
In his commentaries on the book of Acts, Richard Longnecker writes, navigation in this part of the Mediterranean was always dangerous after the 14th of September and was considered impossible after the 11th of November. Paul, knowing this, he gives advice to the centurion that the ship, if it's to push forward, is going to face harsh winter conditions. But you notice in what was just read, the ship's owner, who was also aboard and who had financial motives for pushing the ship onward and delivering his cargo, and as well as the captain, they thought it was best to leave Fair Havens and set out for Phoenix, which was further up the coast of Crete, and spend the winter there. It was impossible to sail on those seas during the winter. Somewhere they're going to have to spend a few months until the spring comes. Paul said, let's stay right where we're at because of the weather. This is not necessarily God-induced. This is not necessarily something that God had told Paul in the dream. Paul is using some common sense. Paul has been on the sea quite a bit. He has traveled on his four missionary journeys on the sea. So he knows the seas quite well. So he uses some common sense. And he's talking to the person who's really in charge, which is the centurion. But there's some opposition. The owner of the ship, as we stated, who has no doubt financial motives to push on. Let's get there as soon as possible so we can get this grain off so that I can get my money and we can get back and try it again. So you got the owner of the ship, and then you have the captain of the ship saying, let's push on. Let's see if we can leave Fairhaven and get to Phoenix and spend the winter there. So Paul is simply outvoted. And so we find the ship setting sail from Fairhaven bound for Phoenix. There are approximately 276 people on board this ship that is loaded with grain, and the ship is already poorly designed, and we already know that it has a rough time being navigated through rough seas. This is what they are going to encounter. So what did we learn about the ship? Our first point was the ship. We learned about Paul's companions. So who's with Paul? Luke
and Aristarchus.
Aristarchus, okay? And they're Paul's companions. What did we learn about Paul's commander?
Julius.
He was a centurion, meaning that
Commander of 100.
he was over 100 men, okay? All right?
And he was a just man.
He was a good man. He was a just man. And evidently there was a relationship between himself and Paul. We learned about Paul's course. What did we learn about Paul's course? What did we learn about Paul's course?
They hugged the land because it was dangerous to sail in the open sea at that time of year.
You worded it very well. They're going to hug the land. They're going to sail real close to the land. And they hope to go to port because this is in the winter, and in that part of the world, this type of ship, very large and clumsy, only has one sail. It doesn't do well in this type of water in the winter. But Paul gives them some counsel, does he not? And Paul gives them counsel according to common sense. What do we learn about Paul's common sense? What do we learn about Paul's counsel toward them? Okay, Paul tells them, since the weather's bad, what should they do? The weather is bad, stay right there. Where is right there? In Fairhaven. Now, who is opposed to that? The captain and the ship owner. The captain and the ship owner. They are opposed. Paul is outvoted. So what is the outcome? They sail on. They sail on. Verses 13 to 20, we move into the storm. The next major point in our lesson, the storm. The title of our lesson, the perfect storm, applies to what is about to happen. A sequence of negative events any one of them would have been dangerous. Just one event would have been dangerous. But to combine this series of negative events is going to make this shipwreck something just waiting to happen. Look at me in verses 13, 14, and 15 as the winds are talked about. Would you read, Deborah, verse 13, 14, and 15?
And when a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along creek close inshore. But before very long, there rushed down from them the land a violent wind called a hurricane. And when the ship was caught in it, they could not face the wind. We gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along.
Now, notice what happens first. The winds are very nice when they first leave Fairhaven. The winds are cooperating. They are soothing winds. And so no doubt the captain of the ship and the owner, they're saying we made the right decision. We made the best decision. But shortly after sailing off, the language turns. The winds become impetuous. They become fierce headwinds, the headwinds of a hurricane. The winds made it impossible for the ship to navigate. They are now driven further off the coast and more now into the sea, away from Crete. There's no doubt in my mind the centurion wished now that he had heeded the voice of Brother Paul. Notice the franticness of the soldiers, verses 16 through 19. The ship's crew is now going to spring into action. They are now in the midst of terrible weather. These are seamen who know something about sailing a ship. Notice their reaction and how they attempt to deal with these fierce winds. Verses 16 to 19. Elder Gavan.
Running under the shelter of a small island called Plata, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables in undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground in the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor and in this way let themselves be driven along. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands.
Now, 4 things happen. I want you to make note of the 4 things that these soldiers do. The first thing they do is that they secure what's called the skiff. Now, the skiff is the small boat that would trail the main boat. It was a small boat that was towed behind the main ship. And when the large ship is anchored in a harbor some miles off from the port, they would use what they call the skiff or the small ship to transfer people from the ship to the island. So they don't want to lose the small boat because this is what's going to be used to transfer you from the big boat to the island. So they secure the skiff. The next thing they do in verse 17 is they use cables to undergird the ship. They began to run large ropes under the bottom of the ship and lash the ends tightly on either side to provide additional support for the hull or the main part of the boat to keep it together. As the winds is thrashing against it, what they are afraid of is that the winds is going to tear it apart. And so the thought is the ropes will hold it together. And so the third thing in verse 18, they lightened the ship. They began throwing things overboard to lighten the ship and cause it to be able to sit higher on top of the sea with all of the cargo. And they got 276 men on board, and the cargo of grain, it allowed the ship to sink deeper into the sea. So they're going to lighten it so it could ride on top of the ship. The thought is, what's good for a cargo if the ship is going to sail? If the ship is going to fail, if the ship is going to sink, you ain't got to worry about no cargo. So they're going to throw all that overboard. And then the last thing verse 19 tells us is that they threw the tackle overboard. They actually began to throw the ship's equipment overboard. All of this was to lighten the load. All of this was an attempt to lighten the load. So the crew throw in what they know to do to help make it possible for them to navigate. All of this is going to give them failing hope, and they find out nothing is really changing. Look at verse number 20. It says, neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. Now, it's important to note that Luke identifies the sun and the stars. And the reason this is made note of, because this was their only navigational tools. They had no compass, they had nothing else to navigate through the sea. They could tell from the position of the sun and the stars at night where they were and how far they were from the coast. So, but the text says, neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. It was very cloudy, and the clouds hid the sun, and at night the clouds made it possible for them to see the stars, and no small storm was assailing us. From then on, get this, all hope, highlight that, all hope of being saved was gradually abandoned. As each day went and there was no appearance of the sun, as each night came and there was no appearing of the stars, they were gradually losing hope. The sea has not quieted down and is still in an uproar. The ship is still being tossed back and forth, and they're yet throwing stuff overboard. And there is no navigational signs, no stars at night, no sun, just gray clouds hanging over. All hope of being saved is gradually being abandoned. I want you to get the word, gradually being abandoned. As the conditions worsen, gradually their hope is dissipating. John Phillips describes this awful time by using these eloquent words. He says, day followed day, overcast with thick clouds, an invisible sun revealing a widely heaving sea, and tumultuous wilderness of an angry, angry wave. Night followed night, thick, black, dark night, with no sign of a single star. Dreadful days followed by appalling nights, with the wind streaking in the riggings and the vessel just scorching, and the horrible sounds. All the while, the force of the wind is howling through like tormented demons, so that no one could hardly think, sleep. On deck was a nightmare. Between the decks was a sense of horror, fear, despair, made worsened by seasickness and the fearful knowledge that even the sailors were going to die, and they themselves have given up hope. In the midst of this storm, there's a sermon. In the midst of this storm, there's a sermon. Brother Justin, that would preach. In the midst of a storm, there's a message. Paul gives a sermon. Paul uses this opportunity to once again to present the gospel. This is seeming to be a hopeless situation. Even the professionals are giving up. The professional seamen see no hope of being saved. Let's travel through this sermon. Let's read through this sermon. Verses 21 through 26. Elder Van, begin to read Paul's sermon.
And when they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, men, you ought to have followed my advice and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this deadly loss. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night, an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. Verse 26.
Verse 26.
Okay. But we must run aground on a certain island.
This violent storm was seen to be a place where a message wouldn't be accepted, but it becomes an ideal place for Paul to preach. Paul, who has a captive audience, he has an audience that wants to hear what he said. Had they listened to him several weeks ago, they would be in safety. But they pushed forward. So now he has a captive audience. They're scared that they're going to die. A perfect opportunity to introduce them to God who can save them. Notice, first of all, in verse 21, notice the word of conviction. Paul didn't go around saying, I told you so. I told you, you should have listened. That's not the attitude behind what he says. Telling them if they hadn't just listened to them and listened to him, they would have been spared of their current conditions. Paul, his point is, what I told you came to pass. I want you to know that I am a man of God. What I'm telling you is the truth. He follows that up with a word of courage. In verse 22, the crew and the other passengers were no doubt glad to hear Paul's great pronouncement about their future. Paul says, there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. The ship is going to be lost, but every person will be saved. And in light of that fact, Paul encourages everyone, notice, to take heart. That is, to be of good courage. Take courage. Take courage. Do not be downcast. Don't operate without hope. Life is going to be spared. The ship, the material thing, will only be lost. As we move into verse 23 and 24, I want you to notice the word of confidence. Paul speaks with confidence in the midst of this trying storm. But how did Paul know for certain that everyone would be saved from the storm? Why? Because an angel of the Lord had appeared to him in the night and told him that he would indeed stand before Caesar. Now remember, Paul had this similar kind of vision in his last stay in Jerusalem when they were about to kill him. And the angel appears and said, be of good courage, Paul. They're not going to do you no harm because you got to go to Rome. You got to go and see Caesar. And so now this angel appears again to Paul and lets him know, reminds him that he must stand before Caesar and all who sail with him would be saved. This message was a reminder to Paul of something that Christ had told Paul 2 years prior when he was in jail in Caesarea. You remember the 23rd chapter of Acts, verse number 11. The word says, be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness of me at Rome. If Jesus said, Paul, you must bear witness of him in Rome, then no storm would prevent that divine appointment from taking place. And I believe that the protective grace that's extended to Paul encompassed all of the others who were on board of the ship. Sometimes God saves a group of people because there is just one godly person. Sometimes God will save a whole family, but sometimes a whole family will experience the grace and protecting of God because of one person in the family who knows God and can call on God and has a personal relationship with God. The crew and the passengers really didn't realize how blessed they were for having Paul traveling with them. Paul gives them a word of challenge in verse 25. Paul must have been a great source of comfort and encouragement to all the others. His faith was unshakable. Paul says, I believe God. Notice the confidence. I believe God that it will be just as he told me. As he told me, this is the way it's going to be. He speaks this to a shaky crew. He speaks this to sailors who are scared. And Paul has confidence. Have you and I had enough experience with God that in the midst of our storm, we can say with confidence that I believe the God of Scripture, that what God has said will happen. Paul has this confidence. He challenges his audience. And then there is the word of caution in verse 26. He says, all will be saved, literally saved from the sea. Now, he's not talking about salvation here. He's not talking about spiritual salvation. He said that all will be saved. He said all will be saved in the physical. He's talking literally saved from this sea, saved from the storm. So Paul told them that they would escape the storm only by running aground on an island that lay ahead. Paul was honest with them. Paul says we will be saved, but it won't be easy. The fact becomes clear as the ship would be lost. That fact becomes a picture really of the Christian life. Those who put their trust in the Lord will be saved. But there will be some twists. There will be some turns. There will be some ups and downs. There will be some losses. But we will be saved as we put our trust in the Lord as we head toward heaven. The last portion of this is verse 27 through 42. The shipwreck. 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 Ship itself, the shipwreck is the climax of this story. This thriller that we find ourselves in. Paul and his crew, they will spend the winter on an island. But not the one that they had originally targeted. Not the one that they originally, remember now, they want to get to where? Phoenix. Paul said stay in Fairhaven. They don't want to go, they don't want to stay in Fairhaven. They want to go to Phoenix. As we study this, they didn't want to stay in Fairhaven because Fairhaven had very cold winters. The winters were milder in Phoenix. So if we're going to spend winter anywhere, why not spend it in a milder climate? So let's go to Phoenix. Paul said, bump that, we need to stay here. They don't want to stay there, so they sail on. They're not going to reach Phoenix. They're away from Fairhaven. They're going to spend the winter in another place. If you notice, as we get to this last section, verse 27 and 8, they're going to find land. Read verse 27 and 28, Deborah.
But when the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And a little further on, they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms.
Now, there have been individuals who have studied this passage of Scripture to give us great insight into the science of sailing during this time. Notice how they find that they're getting closer to land. They have been battling this storm for how long? 14 days. Just this kind of storm. 2 weeks now. They've been battling. And during these 14 nights, the sailors who were professionals sensed that they were nearing land. I don't know if they heard the crashing of the waves against the seashore. I don't know if it was in the air, but they began to sense that land was near. So they began to take what the Scripture says as sounding tests. Sounding tests, and they were going to discover how progressively shallow the waters were. They would let down portions of the anchor into the sea and to allow them to know how close the anchor was to the bottom, which would indicate how close they were to land. So they began to give these types of testings. A good sign would be that they were nearing land, but a bad sign would be that the ship would run aground and be pounded into pieces by the waves. Running aground would mean to suddenly come upon a group of rocks or a sand drop or a group of land that is unhidden by eyesight, and that would cause great damage to the ship. So they keep putting down the anchor to see how far it is they are from land, so hopefully they can avoid any type of shipwreck. Verse 29 indicates what their fear is. Read verse 29, Deborah.
Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak.
To keep the ship from running aground in the shallow water, the crew dropped how many anchors? 4. From the stern, from the front part of the ship, and they began to pray for day to come. And in daylight, they would be able to assess the shoreline and try to maneuver for a safe landing. Now, notice what caused them to pray. What caused them to pray? Caused them to pray.
Fear running around.
Fear of running aground. Fear. They're in a difficult situation. Difficult situations will cause individuals to call out to somebody. Amen. We'll pray to somebody. Those who claim to know not God, have no God. I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God. Let times get bad enough. We'll call on somebody. I don't know him, but you know him, so I'm going to call on your God. They began to pray. Many asked the questions, to whom did this crew pray to? Well, we know who Paul, Luke, and his companion prayed to, but how about the rest of the crew? As the saying goes, there really are no atheists when you're in the foxholes. There really are no atheists when you are on a sinking ship. I don't believe that there were any atheists on the Titanic. I don't believe. All of a sudden you found God. All of a sudden you found the reality of a God when one is facing such imminent death. Fleeing safety. Let's move on to this verse 30 to 32. Read, Deborah.
But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea, on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away.
Now, as the ship shows courage, the ship also shows who are cowards. What do we find in these verses? We find that some of the shipmates, they're going to take the skip, the small boat, and they're going to try to escape. They know that they're near land, but they don't know where land is. So they're going to take the towboat that's following, and they're going to say that we are just letting the towboat down for testing, but their actual plan was to get in and to sail away for themselves. Paul sees them. And Paul warns this centurion that if the sailors are allowed to escape, all on board would be lost. So the centurion, he cut the ropes holding this small towboat. And he allowed the towboat to be blown away from the ship. God had given Paul the promise that everyone would be saved. So these men were fleeing from the promise by God concerning their own protection. Instead of staying in the shadow of God's hand, they decided themselves to take matters into their own hand and try to save themselves. Fortunately, they are not the only ones who follow this particular strategy for life. Verse 33 to 38, we are dealing with discouragement. Read, please, Deborah.
Till the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day, so you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. For not a hair from the head of any of you shall perish. Having said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. All of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food.
Down to verse 38, Deborah.
All of us in the ship were 276 persons, and when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea.
So, what do we find? For 14 days, there's no eating taking place. There's been this long absence of food. They are busy looking, they're busy working, they're busy trying to navigate themselves through this sea. And there was food, but there was no appetite for food. They're in a situation where they don't want to eat, and so they don't eat. Paul, being led by the Spirit and preparing them for what's going to lie ahead, he encourages them to begin to build up their strength. How? By eating some food. And they were all, verse 36 says, they were all encouraged. Food became an encourager. They began to feel their strength. They began to feel like they were able to do something as they ate. Paul set an example himself by being the first one to break the bread, and he gave thanks to God. Once again, he is just giving his testimony. He's preaching. He's giving his testimony to these individuals in the midst of their storm, and he's the first one to break the bread himself. Then in preparation for landfall, they began to throw the remaining cargo of grain into the sea. For what reason? To lighten the ship's load. At daybreak, verse 39 and 40 is going to tell us they see an island which they do not recognize. It's an island that wasn't necessarily on their map that they had seen before. Read verse 39 and 40, Deborah.
When they came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach.
Okay.
And they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail to the wind. Then they were heading for the beach.
It's not Phoenix. We know it's not Fairhaven. It's an island that we don't recognize. This is something strange, but they do spot a bay. They do spot an area where the ship may be able to sail into. And it has a sandy beach that looked like the safest place for landfall. What do? We see them releasing anchors, and they begin to raise the one mast mainsail that they have, all in hopes of the wind catching the sail and blowing them into the bay that will cause them to be near the beach. But their plans fall short. Read verse 41.
But striking a reef, the two seas met. They ran the vessel aground, and the prow struck fast and remained immovable. But the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves.
It was a good plan, but they didn't see. They didn't see what was underneath. It was a good plan from human imagination. It was a good plan according to all that they knew about sailing, but they did not see what was underneath the waters. They fell short of their mark. The bottom, the prow of the ship hit this sandy bottom, which was a good away from the shore, and it became large or stuck, and they couldn't move, while at the same time these violent waves keep pounding and pounding the ship at the stern. The ship would ultimately be broken up. Now it's time to abandon the ship. Finish this chapter on out there, 42 to 44. Read.
The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion wanted to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. And the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they all were brought safely to land.
Now, when you first read this, you got to understand the Roman policy there regarding prisoners. The Roman policy regarding guards was that if a prisoner was to escape, the guard who was guarding him would be killed. So rather than taking the risk of any other prisoners, Paul included, rather than any other prisoners escaping, the soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners before they abandoned the ship. The idea is we abandon the ship and they start swimming, some may escape. And you know the policy, if they escape, we have to take their lives. So I'm not taking my life for nobody. I'm not giving my life for nobody. I'm going to kill all the prisoners. Julius, the centurion, wanting primarily to save Paul, ordered the soldiers not to touch the prisoners. He commanded that all who could swim to simply jump overboard and make their way to shore. And for those who couldn't swim, to find something to hold on to that would keep them afloat. And verse 44 simply says, and so it was that they all escaped safely to land. Paul escapes yet another attempt on his life. So he was still not yet in Rome. The promise of Jesus is that he would be kept. And so his courage is there. His faith is intact. Now, what does this story teach us? What does this narrative say to us? What can we learn from these 14 days in the midst of this horrible storm in the Mediterranean Sea? You and I may never get into a literal storm. I remember on my last cruise, just looking out and you could see nothing but water. No land in sight on no matter where you went, to the stern, to the back, to the right, to the left. It was just nothing but sea. The thought came to my mind, what would happen if all of a sudden there was a storm? Maybe we will never get into a literal storm like the one that Paul and the others endured, but there are plenty of life storms in which we can apply at least 7 lessons and more I want to give you. The first one is, as we look at the summary, and you can look in your outline, the summary, the probability of storms in the Christian life. I don't know about you, but the late great preacher Adrian Rogers, who was one of my favorite Sunday evening preachers that I would rush home to listen to, Adrian Rogers, he once said, every Christian is like this. He is either in a storm or coming out of a storm or simply heading into a storm. He was not, of course, talking about some literal storm, although hurricanes and tornadoes in our day does cause many people to go through difficult times. Adrian Rogers was talking about the storms of life. The storms, the way the Apostle Paul mentioned them in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 12. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trials which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. We shouldn't say, why me? When we go through the storms in life, they are part of life. They are part of this fallen, sinful world. And each storm will serve to build our faith and to shore up our purposes in life. The probability of storms in the Christian life are almost perfect. Number 2, the paradox of storms in the Christian life. Paul was in God's perfect will and found himself in a perfect storm. Don't allow people to tell you when you find yourself in a storm, you're out of the will of God. Paul was in God's perfect will, and he found himself in a perfect storm. The paradox of God's protective care is that sometimes he protects us in the storm instead of removing us from the storm. Some preachers like to teach that to be in God's will means never having to go through any difficult time. Meaning never having to go through any health problems. Simply means operating in health, wealth, and prosperity. But that wasn't the teachings of Jesus, nor was it the teachings of Paul. The danger in that teaching is that when, not if, but when you find yourself in a storm, it causes great confusion. You must then be out of the will of God. That's false teaching. All saints will go through storms. All saints will go through some difficulties in life. The predictability of storms. Our next point, the predictability of storms. Paul was on his way to the most important assignment of his life. And he had to fight through a storm to get there. I've learned that that's the way it usually works. When you have an important assignment from God, you will be tested as to your willingness to go through. You will be tested by your faithfulness to go through. You will be tested by your courage to accept it and to keep the appointment. To keep the appointment. You will have storms. The presence of storms in the Christian life. The point is, God is always present in the storms that accompany the Christian life. Just as an angel of the Lord appeared to Paul to assure him in the middle of the sea, so God's presence will assure us regardless of where you are and what kind of storm you're in. Some of the most intimate, revealing lessons, revealing passages that you will ever receive from God will be found in your most difficult times. God is simply in the midst of every storm. The promise of God in the storms of the Christian life, even if God had not sent an angel to confirm his safety, Paul could have known that he would arrive and survive the storm. Why? Because of the promise that God had given him in Acts 23 and verse 11. Jesus had already told Paul that he must bear witness for him in Rome. And the only way he could do that was that he had to arrive in Rome, meaning that he would not be lost at sea. The promises that we find in God's word are given to sustain us even through our darkest of hours.
Amen.
Only to assure us that the waves will not carry us overboard.
Yes.
And that we will not be washed away by life's difficulties. We will survive to complete what God has appointed us to do. The purpose of the storms in the Christian life. I believe storms help create character for believers. It creates character in the long run, but in the short run, it reveals what kind of character we have. The character of Paul was faith. The character of Paul was courage. The character of Paul was boldness. The character of Paul was to stand in the midst of darkness. It's a contrast to the character of the sailors who were fearful, even attempting to escape to save their own lives. You see, circumstances don't determine our character in the moment. They only reveal the character that you already have. You already have character. Your storms is going to reveal what kind of character. You can say you believe and sing all the happy Christian songs when everything is going well. But what do you sing when the storm comes? Even if we're fearful going into the storm can help build our character. The storm can help reveal to us who God is. We can become stronger as we're going to run into another storm. But we can never blame our lack of faith on our surroundings. This is what you're made of. Now is the time to build your character. And then last but not least, it's the product of the storm in the Christian life. God wants our faith to be a source of strength for others who are also in a storm who don't know Jesus. If you remain focused on God, others will be encouraged to trust Him. Paul and his two companions were the only ones who knew God, and because of their testimony, there's no doubt, as we're going to see in chapter 28, others are going to be influenced to know who God is and even trust Him to be their Savior. Others will be encouraged. 3 times in this story, Paul is acting as the encourager, urging them in verse 22, verse 25, and verse 34 to take heart, be of good courage. And you and I can do the same in the midst of the storm that we're going through. I don't know about your life personally. I don't know if you're going through a particular storm or not, but I want you to know that if you only stay focused on God, if you only stay focused on God, knowing that He's with you, you will arrive safely on the other side to continue to do the will of God. I have here on my desk, on my table, I have here what I call lessons and observations from chapter 27. This is such a powerful lesson. There are several more lessons here from this chapter that I want you to take home and I want you to read and gather. We try to milk as much as we can from this chapter. This chapter is more than just a narrative. It's just more than a story. It's here in the Bible for a good reason. Let me read a few of these for you. Number 1 says, a Christian's influence for good can go a long way in creating good in life situations. Number 2, on the sea of life, many continue to sail headlong into the upcoming storms in spite of biblical warnings. Number 3, a Christian and his faith can be of great encouragement to others during a time of crisis. Many have experienced wrecks today, wrecked homes, wrecked marriages, wrecked families, even wrecked faith, according to 1 Timothy 1:19, wrecked jobs, wrecked friendships. But God can give deliverance through it all. And there are others here, so we encourage you to take one of these along with your outline. And sometime this week, today, go back and read over this passage of scripture. And whatever you're going through, as a believer, take courage. That in God, you're in the best hands possible. Are there any observations, any questions concerning today's lesson?